1. Tonight, as you settle in for rest, I invite you to journey with me, not just through history, but through time and memory. Let your mind drift softly toward the golden-tinted twilight of an empire that once ruled the known world. Picture marble columns catching the afternoon sun, the rustle of silk robes sweeping through grand corridors, and the distant murmur of Latin verses echoing beneath vaulted ceilings. This was Rome at its zenith, a sprawling, glittering marvel of ambition, architecture, and intellect. But what goes up, they say, must eventually fall. This is not the story of a single event, a climactic battle, or a final fiery collapse. Rather, it is the slow unraveling of a dream that once believed itself eternal. The fall of Rome was not a sudden thunderclap. It was a long, melancholic symphony played in ever-softening notes over centuries. And as you listen tonight, there's no need to strain to recall names or dates. Simply allow yourself to float through the story, letting each word paint a picture, each chapter a gentle step into a world long lost, but still lingering in the bones of modern life. We begin, not with the end, but with the grandeur that made the fall so tragic. The Rome of Augustus and Trajan, of Cicero and Virgil, of temples and triumphs and roadways still etched across the earth. A place that considered itself the center of the world, caput mundi, and, for a time, truly was. Its legions marched in lockstep, its aqueducts stretched across hillsides like silver veins, and its laws laid the foundation for centuries of governance yet to come. Yet even as its monuments gleamed and its standards snapped in the wind, cracks had begun to form beneath the surface. Empires, like people, do not crumble in a single breath. They wear down, they buckle under pressure, they rot slowly from within. Beneath the surface of Rome's power, currents of discontent swirled. Economic stagnation, political corruption, and relentless military campaigns drained the lifeblood of the Republic that had once dared to conquer the world. The sense of shared civic duty that once bound Roman citizens began to erode, replaced by apathy, cynicism, and bitter divisions. And so the story of Rome's downfall begins not with barbarians at the gates, but with slow, almost imperceptible decay. Imagine, if you will, a weary merchant, closing his stall early, muttering about rising taxes and vanishing customers. Picture a senator, once proud and upright, now bribed into silence, his voice a whisper in a once thunderous chamber. See a soldier sharpening his blade by flickering torchlight, wondering if his wages will arrive before hunger does. The decline began not in battlefields, but in boardrooms, kitchens, and alleyways. As the 3rd century dawned, Rome found itself at a dangerous crossroads. Its empire had grown vast, perhaps too vast to manage. The distant provinces of Gaul, Egypt, and Britannia strained against the control of a central government increasingly out of touch. Trade routes, once the arteries of Roman prosperity, became less secure. Pirates prowled the seas, bandits stalked the roads, and local governors began acting more like kings than administrators. The result was fragmentation, a centrifugal pull that threatened to tear the empire apart at the seams. The crisis deepened as emperors came and went in a dizzying blur, some reigning for mere months before falling to the sword or poison. Civil war became a grim ritual. Rivals declared themselves emperors from the provinces, each backed by their own legions, each convinced they alone could save Rome. The empire became a battlefield of egos and ambitions, its people caught in the crossfire. Amid the chaos, the frontiers weakened. Rome had long relied on its military superiority to repel external threats, but now, legions once feared across the known world were stretched thin and underpaid. Along the Rhine and Danube, Germanic tribes, once repelled by iron and discipline, began to push back. Their incursions were not sudden invasions, but steady, probing tests of Roman resolve. And increasingly, the response from Rome was slow, fractured, or absent altogether. At home, the situation was no better. Inflation surged. Coins that once gleamed with gold and silver became thin, debased imitations. Farmers abandoned their land, unable to pay taxes or protect their fields from raiders. Cities shrank as populations fled to the countryside or perished from plague, famine, or violence. The proud Roman middle class, the artisans, tradesmen, and teachers who gave the empire its character, began to vanish. It is easy from our vantage point to see the signs, but to those living through it, the decline was more subtle. Most Romans continued with their daily lives, clinging to routines as the world around them shifted like sand beneath their feet. A butcher sharpened his knives, a potter spun his wheel, a child recited his Latin lessons, all unaware that they were walking through the twilight of an era. And yet, despite everything, Rome endured. For decades more, perhaps even centuries, it would stagger forward. Reforms would be attempted. Brief resurgences would flicker to life before being snuffed out by reality. There were still victories to be won, still roads to pave, still dreams to dream. But the grandeur of old, the unity, the confidence, the sense of destiny, was slipping away. This is the story we will explore together. Not a tale of heroes and villains, but of systems too vast to steer, of people doing their best amid forces they couldn't control. of decisions made in palaces that rippled across continents, and yes, of the quiet beauty found even in decline, a statue weathered but still standing, a mosaic glinting through the dust, a lullaby sung in a crumbling villa. So as you lie back and let your thoughts drift, know that you are not alone in this journey. I will be here, a gentle voice in the darkness, guiding you through the winding corridors of Rome's final centuries. There is no rush, no urgency, only the steady unfolding of time and the echo of an empire whose shadow still stretches across our world. As Rome continued its slow march toward uncertainty, the kind of men who wore the purple began to change. Gone were the days of thoughtful rulers like Augustus or Marcus Aurelius, leaders guided by duty, principle, and an enduring belief in the Roman ideal. Instead, the imperial throne began to attract a very different kind of occupant, men driven not by service, but by spectacle. One of the most infamous among them was Commodus, the son of the philosopher king Marcus Aurelius. When he ascended the throne in 177 AD at the age of just 19, many hoped he might inherit his father's wisdom. Instead, what they got was a ruler fascinated less by governance and more by gladiator games, pageantry, and his own reflection in polished bronze. Commodus fancied himself a living god. He strutted through the palace in lion skins and Hercules costumes, often demanding others address him as the reincarnation of the demigod himself. He took to the arena not as a spectator, but as a performer, fighting choreographed matches where his opponents were ordered to fall at his feet. It was theatrical, it was absurd, and it was dangerous, not because he was a great warrior, but because an emperor playing at games was an emperor not governing the empire. The Senate, long a check on imperial excesses, was increasingly sidelined. Commodus renamed Rome after himself, Colonia Commodiana, and even rechristened the calendar months with names that honored his many inflated titles. To flatter him was to rise, to oppose him was to disappear. Assassination, once a whispered rumor, became a political tool passed from hand to hand like a dagger. And in 192 AD, the inevitable happened. Commodus was murdered in his palace, strangled in his bath by a wrestler, after multiple plots converged. But his death didn't restore balance. It shattered what little stability remained. What followed was a blur, a parade of emperors rising and falling like leaves in a storm. The 3rd century would see nearly 20 emperors in just a few decades, many ruling only for months before being stabbed, poisoned, or betrayed. The imperial office, once the pinnacle of Roman strength, became a fragile, fatal crown, coveted by many, survived by few. Much of this chaos was driven not from Rome, but by the military. The Praetorian Guard, once tasked with protecting emperors, now chose them. They auctioned off the throne to the highest bidder, turning imperial succession into a game of bribery and ambition. A competent general with a loyal legion could proclaim himself emperor in the provinces and march on the capital, and many did. This constant turnover brought devastating consequences. Civil wars erupted regularly, infrastructure projects stalled, provincial governors acted with growing independence, and the empire's enemies watched carefully, waiting for their moment. Meanwhile, the economy, so long the engine of Roman might, began to crumble. Soil that had been farmed for generations yielded less with each harvest. Fields lay fallow, not because the land was poor, but because the farmers had fled, driven away by taxes too heavy to bear or by the fear of raiders. Cities that once bustled with trade and laughter now echoed with emptiness. Currency, once trusted and stable, became a shell of its former self. Coins were clipped, debased, melted, and reminted until they held little real value. Inflation spiraled. A loaf of bread that once cost a single denarius might now require a basketful. Commerce faltered. Trust dissolved. People turned inward, hoarding what little they had, bartering for survival. Social structures, too, began to strain. The divide between rich and poor widened until it became a chasm. The elite clung to their wealth behind fortified villas, while the urban poor scavenged for crumbs. Rebellions flared, not grand insurrections, but small fires of resentment in rural provinces, quickly snuffed out, only to spark again elsewhere. Religion began to stir. As traditional Roman gods lost their grip on the public imagination, mystery cults and foreign deities gained followers. The old temples stood, but many were empty. People searched for meaning in a world that seemed increasingly unpredictable and cold. Among these rising beliefs was Christianity, still a minority faith, but growing, whispering of salvation, equality, and a kingdom not of this earth. And yet, even in decline, Rome remained vast, majestic, and difficult to destroy. The roads still connected distant corners of the world. The legions, though weary, still marched. The language, the law, the sheer inertia of centuries still gave the illusion of permanence. But illusions fade. In the countryside, bandits roamed freely. Along the frontiers, Germanic tribes pressed harder. Rome could no longer muster the swift, decisive responses of old. Military units were underpaid, undermanned, and underfed. Soldiers deserted, morale withered. Campaigns ended not with parades, but with quiet retreats. It is tempting to look at this period and wonder, how did it all fall apart so completely? But decline is never a straight line. It wavers. There were emperors who tried, Decius, Aurelian, even Diocletian later on, men who fought to patch the cracks and steady the foundations. And sometimes for a while it worked. But no patch can hold forever if the structure beneath is hollowing. The 3rd century was not merely a time of misrule. It was a test of institutions, of beliefs, of the Roman spirit itself. It revealed that the empire, once held together by roads and laws and legions, was now sustained mostly by memory and myth. And still people lived. They married. They buried their dead. They shared bread. They whispered old stories to their children by firelight, of Romulus and Remus, of Caesar crossing the Rubicon, of gods who once walked among men. Those stories mattered, because Rome, more than just a place or a government, had always been an idea. And while buildings crumble and rulers fall, ideas linger. They echo. They wait. As we continue this journey, know that we're not yet at the end. The fall of Rome is not a single moment. It is a twilight stretched over generations. And though shadows now stretch long across the land, there is still light enough to see what once was, and what may still endure. So, take another deep breath. Let the weight of marble and myth settle gently on your chest. The road ahead remains winding and rich with lessons, and I'll be here still, your guide through the dusk of empire. 071.403. As the crisis of the 3rd century slowly began to wane, a battered Rome drew a ragged breath. The chaos had not fully ended, but there was a lull, a pause before the next storm. Under the leadership of Diocletian, the empire gathered what strength it had left and tried to stitch itself back together. Yet the world beyond Rome's crumbling frontiers had changed, and with it, so too had the dangers it faced. Rome had always been surrounded by rivals. Tribal groups across the Rhine, the Danube, and in the shadowy forest beyond had long challenged Roman authority. For centuries, legions marched across borders, defeating, dispersing, and sometimes recruiting these so-called barbarians. Franks, Saxons, Vandals, Goths. But where once Rome stood dominant, now it teetered. The constant wars and internal strife had weakened the legions. Once the pride of the empire, they were now exhausted, underfunded, and often undermanned. Veteran soldiers had been replaced by conscripts and mercenaries. Morale was low, supplies scarce. What had once been an unbreakable wall now showed cracks. Across the frontier, the world stirred. The tribes had grown stronger, more organized. Loose confederations were becoming kingdoms. Charismatic leaders emerged, chieftains who no longer merely raided Roman lands, but envisioned empires of their own. Among them, one group would rise to prominence like no other: the Goths. The Goths were a Germanic people who had migrated from the north, perhaps from the shores of Scandinavia, to settle near the Black Sea. For generations, they had danced a complex waltz with the empire, enemies at times, allies at others. By the early 4th century, the Goths had split into 2 main branches: the Visigoths in the west, the Ostrogoths in the east. And then came the Huns. No one is entirely sure where the Huns came from. They rode out of the Central Asian steppes like a storm, fierce, fast, and seemingly unstoppable. Masters of mounted warfare, their arrivals shook the very ground beneath the Roman world. As they moved westward, they sent shockwaves through the tribes ahead of them. The Goths, in desperation, turned to Rome. In 376, the Visigoths petitioned Emperor Valens for asylum. They begged to be allowed to cross the Danube and settle within Roman territory, away from the rampaging Huns. Valens agreed, reluctantly and with conditions. The Goths would surrender their weapons, provide hostages, and settle under Roman oversight. It was a decision that would ripple through history. The reality was far from humane. The Gothic refugees were treated with cruelty. Roman officials extorted them, starved them, even sold their children into slavery in exchange for scraps of food. Resentment simmered, then boiled. In 378, it erupted. At the Battle of Adrianople, the Visigoths rose in revolt. Valens marched out to meet them, confident of a swift victory. What followed was one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman history. The Roman army was annihilated. Valens himself was killed. Some say he died in battle. Others say he was burned alive in a farmhouse after seeking shelter. It was more than just a lost battle. It was a turning point. Never again would Rome recover full control of its borders. The illusion of invincibility had been shattered, and yet life went on. In the wake of Adrianople, uneasy truces were forged. The Visigoths became federati, barbarian allies of Rome allowed to settle within the empire in exchange for military service. It was a pragmatic solution, born of necessity, not trust. For Rome no longer had the manpower or resources to defend every frontier. It now leaned on the very peoples it once sought to conquer. But trust is a fragile thing. Over the next decades, Rome and its federati would clash again and again. Ambitions flared, loyalties shifted, and in the early 5th century, the unthinkable happened. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, a man once trained in Roman warfare, marched on Rome itself. The eternal city, untouched by foreign enemies for over 800 years, now trembled. In 410, the gates fell. The city was sacked. It wasn't a complete destruction. The sack of Rome by Alaric's forces was measured, almost restrained. Churches were spared, civilians often left unharmed. But the symbolism was undeniable. Rome had been breached. The world gasped. Elsewhere, other tribes followed the path the Goths had cleared. The Vandals swept through Gaul, then Spain, and finally into North Africa, seizing the empire's breadbasket. The Franks and Saxons pushed into northern Gaul and Britain. The empire shrank, its borders bleeding away, province by province. In response, emperors became increasingly ceremonial, figures propped up by generals, often puppets in a larger game of regional power. Real authority lay with military strongmen, many of them of barbarian origin. Rome no longer ruled, it managed, negotiated, survived. And through it all, ordinary people lived their lives. Farmers still tilled their fields, mothers still rocked infants to sleep, merchants still counted coins and worried over ledgers. They adjusted to new rulers, new taxes, new gods. Some mourned the old ways, others welcomed change. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was a ghost of its former self. Its armies were largely mercenary, its coffers nearly empty. Its emperors came and went, often dying violently, often forgotten. Then came Attila. The leader of the Huns, nicknamed the Scourge of God, swept through the empire with devastating speed. His campaigns left cities in ashes and populations scattered. In 452 he marched on Italy itself. The imperial court fled, Rome stood vulnerable. And yet, in a strange twist of fate, Attila turned away. Legends swirl around his decision, a diplomatic appeal from Pope Leo, an outbreak of disease, a dream of divine warning. Whatever the cause, Rome was spared, this time, but the end was near. In 476, the last Western Roman emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. The imperial regalia was sent east to Constantinople. The Western Empire was no more. It had not fallen with fire and fury, but with a whimper, a soft collapse after centuries of erosion. Still, even as the Western Empire faded, its legacy endured. In the east, the Byzantine Empire, Rome's heir, carried on. Latin remained the language of the church and the law. Roman roads, aqueducts, and monuments stood for centuries. The dream of Rome would echo on, in Charlemagne's empire, in Mussolini's rhetoric, in Washington's marble halls, but the empire itself, that ancient engine of conquest and civilization, was gone. And so we pause here, at this quiet milepost in our journey through time. The eternal city, though battered, still stands in stone and memory. The empire, though broken, still lives in the world it helped shape. Close your eyes now, if you haven't already. Let the ruins settle into your dreams, and remember, even empires fall, but their stories remain. Though the Western Roman Empire had faded into the dust, the story of Rome was far from over. In the east, Constantinople still glittered, rising above the Bosphorus like a dream preserved in marble and gold. The Byzantine Empire, Rome's legacy reborn, endured for nearly 1,000 years more, and yet, even as it held fast to Roman traditions, it too would one day face the familiar echoes of decline. But before we drift too far eastward, let us return briefly to the legacy left behind in the ashes of the West. The fall of Rome did not mean the end of civilization. Far from it. In the vacuum it left, new powers emerged. Some sought to restore what had been lost. Others dreamed entirely new dreams. Among them was the Christian Church, which rose like ivy through the crumbling stones of empire. What began as a persecuted sect had, by the 4th century, become the empire's official religion. After Rome's fall, the church became one of the few stable institutions left standing. Bishops filled the void left by governors. Cathedrals rose where temples once stood. Latin, once the language of empire, became the sacred tongue of scripture and ceremony. In many ways, the church became the new Rome. Its rituals, hierarchy, and power structures echoed those of the imperial system. The Pope became a spiritual emperor, guiding not armies but souls, and in monasteries scattered across Europe, monks carefully copied ancient texts, preserving the words of Cicero, Virgil, and Aristotle through long winters and darker days. This quiet preservation mattered more than anyone could have known. For centuries later, during the Renaissance, these texts would be rediscovered, their ideas sparking revolutions in science, philosophy, and art. But the road to that rediscovery was long and often shadowed. Europe after Rome was not a wasteland, as some might imagine, but it was fragmented. The great roads were still there, though in disrepair. The aqueducts, though silent, still arched across valleys, but the grand forums were empty, and the statues wore coats of moss and ivy. In the towns and countryside, life went on, simpler, more localized, shaped by seasons and survival, rather than senates and empires. New kingdoms rose from the bones of Rome, the Franks in Gaul, the Visigoths in Hispania, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Anglo-Saxons in Britain. These were not mere destroyers, they were settlers, rulers, builders in their own right. They adopted Roman customs, laws, and even titles. Many converted to Christianity, forging alliances with bishops and popes. In this fusion of Roman legacy and Germanic vitality, medieval Europe was born. Charlemagne, crowned emperor of the Romans in 800 AD, saw himself as heir to Caesar and Constantine alike. His court at Aachen was modelled after Roman ideals. His scribes revived Latin learning, and though his empire would fracture after his death, the idea of Rome, of centralized authority and divine right, remained potent. Even centuries later, emperors of the Holy Roman Empire claimed descent from the Caesars. Their crowns glittered with imperial imagery, their laws cloaked in Roman precedent. Rome had died, but it had not vanished. It had become something else. Meanwhile, in the east, the Byzantine Empire thrived, though not without trials of its own. Constantinople stood as a beacon of wealth and culture, surrounded by high walls and guarded by the brilliant Greek fire of its navy. Its emperors, from Justinian to Basil II, preserved Roman law, reformed administration, and sponsored stunning mosaics and domes that still dazzle the eye. Yet the Byzantines were not immune to decline. Infighting, religious schisms, and the pressures of external enemies slowly eroded their strength. In 1204, Crusaders, fellow Christians, sacked Constantinople in a fit of greed and mistrust. The city recovered, but never fully. By the time the Ottomans arrived in 1453, the empire was a shadow. The fall of Constantinople marked the true end of the Roman world, east and west alike. Yet even then the flame was not fully extinguished. The Renaissance would rekindle it. Artists like Michelangelo, scholars like Petrarch, and thinkers like Erasmus all looked to Rome for inspiration. They walked among the ruins, not with sorrow, but with reverence. The domes they built, the verses they penned, the republics they imagined, all bore the imprint of Roman ideals. And so, in a strange way, Rome never really fell. It transformed. It scattered seeds that would take root in the minds and hearts of countless generations. Its architecture shaped cathedrals and capitals. Its legal codes informed modern law. Its language birthed French, Spanish, Italian, and more. Its symbols, laurel wreaths, eagles, SPQR, still decorate buildings and seals. Its stories of empire and exile, of ambition and collapse continue to teach. Because Rome, ultimately, was never just a city. It was a concept, a promise, a question. Can human beings create something eternal? Perhaps the answer lies not in permanence, but in echo. And now, as we come to the gentle close of this tale, let us return to that twilight we began with, to the city of 7 hills, bathed in amber light. Its stones are worn, its streets aged, but listen closely, and you'll still hear the footsteps of senators, the creak of chariots, the laughter of children in crowded forums. Rome breathes, not as it once did, but as memory, as myth, as dream. Let that dream accompany you tonight, a quiet companion as you drift into rest. Let the weight of centuries ease into softness, like dust settling over mosaic floors. And if, in your sleep, you walk through Roman streets, know that countless others have done the same, across time, across distance, across memory. Good night, traveler, and may your dreams be as enduring as the empire that refused to be forgotten.